In today's video, green honey, weird pronouns, gay Vikings, pre-human art, and the double slit in time experiment. Hello, welcome to Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. My name is Scott, and this is a new series on this channel. I learnt recently, a video where we censor the word stuff so that YouTube doesn't demonetize me. This is the pilot episode of a new series, and it's just what it says on the tin. I tell you all about all the interesting things I found out about recently. If you want to see more of this kind of video, please like, comment, subscribe, share, do all of the things. The more love this gets, the more likely I am to make more of these videos. Let's just jump straight in with the cool facts. Gold used to be red and honey used to be green. At least that's how some ancient people described them. Homer described the sky as bronze, hair and honey as green, the sea as a deep wine colour, and this is often cited as evidence to argue that the Greeks' perception of colour was different to ours, that language and colour are somehow linked in our brain. This is backed up by a 2011 BBC documentary about the Himbas people of Namibia, whose language has not been influenced by the Western culture, and hence the words that they have for colours don't translate into red, blue, green. Similarly, those colours that I just listed, they don't have corresponding words in the Himbas language. They just have a completely different colour spectrum. This BBC documentary reported that the Himbas were given 12 squares arranged in a circle, kind of like a clock, and that they could identify tiny differences when those differences changed colour in their language, but for us were essentially green. But that the Himbas couldn't identify a blue square among green squares because they were the same colour in their language. The experiment in this documentary was falsified. The actual experiment showed that the Himbas took slightly longer to identify the odd colour, and also that when the colour was at 3 or 9 o'clock, they were quickest, while when it was at 12 and 6 o'clock, they were slowest. The paper attached to this experiment was never actually published. It was never peer-reviewed, and we only know about the changed reaction time due to a leaked email. So we don't even know if this experiment is repeatable. It should be noted that just because this data was falsified, it doesn't mean that the theory is incorrect, but rather there's no evidence for it, which means it's probably incorrect. The other explanation that is really popular is that we have red gold and green honey in ancient times for the same reason we have purple blueberries, green white grapes, and purple red onions. Nobody is seriously suggesting that onion farmers don't know the difference between red and purple, although if you've met them, you'll probably change your mind on that. Our descriptions are culture dependent, and they're not always accurate. After all, white wine doesn't look like milk, and the ancients probably didn't think honey looked like grass either. This topic is still being debated, but it is fascinating for some weird reason. Japanese pronouns. Pronouns are a controversial subject at the moment, and that's mainly because a large section of our society don't know what a pronoun is, but they don't like them. Sorry, I shouldn't have used they to describe them. Oh no, sorry, I've done it again. And now I've used I to describe me. And now me. Pronouns are essential. In Japan, pronouns are more complex, but they're still attached to identity. And there are just more pronouns, and they communicate different things like personality, the region that the person is from, the formality of the language, the age of the person, the relationship to you, and so much more. Pronouns can go across gender. While a lot of pronouns can communicate a mostly female or mostly male identity, that doesn't apply in an absolute sense. There are exceptions. For example, boku is used for men, but can also be for women. It is rare for a girl to call themselves boku, but it is growing in popularity. Also, one of the things I really like about Japanese pronouns is that your name is a pronoun. Moving on to gay Vikings. Loki was a gender-fluid bisexual, and Odin was trans. Loki can shapeshift and change genders at will. They were also very clearly bisexual. Loki even gave birth to a horse after turning into a mare and having sex with a stallion. The foal would go on to become Odin's 8-legged steed. Despite Loki giving birth, he's usually referred to as a man and with male pronouns. Odin practiced a female type of magic which he learnt from Freya. That includes fortune telling. Loki at one point even mocks him for practicing this type of magic. Calm down, Loki. At least Odin didn't get kinky with a horse. Odin doesn't deny this. Actually, Odin's response is basically to tell Loki, so what, you do it too. From this, it's been suggested that Odin may have been bigendered, non-binary, or trans. There is a figurine that exists called Odin from Lear, which shows Odin wearing typical Iron Age woman's dress. A 2013 paper concluded from this that at some point in Viking history, at the very least, the idea of gender would have been much broader than our current ideas. It really is impossible to say that Odin was trans from this because we don't know how the Vikings saw gender, but it's definitely one conclusion that we can come to. Just generally, Vikings' idea around sexuality were completely different to ours. Bisexual Vikings were common, as too was polyamory. It would be common for a Viking to take multiple wives and for the first wife to form a special attachment to one of the wives, which in many cases was sexual. Men also often had sex with men before they married. They would also rape the losers of battle as a form of humiliation. Moving on to something much lighter, did you know you can count to 12 on the fingers of one hand? There are a few cultures that have a base 12 counting system instead of a base 10. This was common in ancient Mesopotamia, Babylon and all those lot. And we still see the remnants of that today. We have 60 minutes in an hour, 12 hours in a day, 360 degrees in a circle. Those cultures used to count on their fingers by counting every bone of the finger and excluding the thumb entirely. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 on one hand. Let's talk about these footprints that have been discovered in North America, which challenge when humans first reached North America. The current theory is that about 13,000 years ago, towards the end of the last ice age, the Bering Land Bridge started to melt and allowed people to cross from Russia into Alaska on foot, and this population became the first people in the Americas. There is a competing theory that about 1,000 years prior to that melting, humans essentially hopped along the coast in boats and made their way into the Americas that way. There is a lot of evidence to back up both of these theories: DNA testing, archaeological evidence, proof of inhabitation, tools and so on have been discovered. But now there are these new footprints that have been discovered in White Sands National Park in New Mexico, and they've been dated to between 21,130 years ago to 22,800 years ago. Maybe humans did come into America via that land bridge, but there may have been some people in here before. Genetic testing of indigenous Americans show that their population diverged from Asian populations around 16,000 years ago, which means that is the earliest time they could have inhabited the Americas, which means that they couldn't have made those footprints. So the conclusions that we can come to from this is that the footprints aren't human, the dating is incorrect, or that there was a populations of human living in North America before the indigenous Americans arrived. That there is this 5,000 to 7,000 year gap between the two populations means that it's actually possible that there was this population living there and they completely died out before the indigenous Americans arrived. To complicate things, a 2015 study found that there were genetic markers in people historically living in the Amazon that were from indigenous Australians and Melanesians. There is a long-held but not very credible theory that Australian Aboriginals were the first to inhabit the Americas, and while this doesn't prove that, it is certainly an intriguing find. Obviously, it is a long trip between Australia and the Americas, but we know that people from Malaysia settled in Madagascar about 2,000 years ago, which is a similar length voyage. We know this happened from the language of the Madagascans and various crops that they have there that don't grow there natively. When I was looking up how likely it was that humans could have built a boat to make such a voyage, I found out two things that were really fascinating. 60,000 years ago, we know that humans crossed from New Guinea into Australia, a considerable sea voyage. And much, much longer ago than that, 700,000 years ago, we have found conclusive evidence that Homo erectus, a proto-human species that predated us by at least 500,000 years, we have evidence of them using boats. Nothing that you would cross the Pacific in, but if they're using boats that long ago, surely we could have figured something out. Going back to that 2015 study, we don't actually know how the Indigenous Australian marker got to the Amazon, and there are other solutions to this anomaly than the Indigenous Australians settled the Americas and then merged with the Indigenous Americans. And I would suggest that a much more likely explanation is to look at how sweet potato got from South America into Polynesia. We can see that there has clearly been some sort of trade between the Polynesians and the South Americans. And maybe along with trade, there was a little bit of family making and a little bit of DNA went that way. While I was looking this up, I found something else that is just bizarre and amazing, and I just have to include it in here. Mammoth bones with cut marks in them that could only have been made by tools were discovered in California, dating to not 13,000 years ago, but 130,000 years ago, tenfold the current theory. These cuttings look like the kind of marks that you would make when you butcher an animal. This is a controversial idea and it's got its critics, but it has been backed up by a second group of scientists, and a quick search on Google Scholar shows just how many papers are agreeing with this versus criticizing it. This seems really credible. 130,000 years ago is so old that scientists aren't saying that humans were in North America then. They're saying that hominins were in North America then. They're saying that it could be Homo sapiens, but it could also be a human-like species similar to Neanderthal, but almost certainly not Neanderthals. That's fascinating. Staying with archaeology, but moving on to human evolution, Lee Berger, the discoverer of Homo Naledi, has announced that Homo Naledi also used tools, had fire, buried their dead, and most shockingly, created art. This is the oldest example of art ever discovered, dated back before our species even evolved. And it looks eerily similar to human Stone Age art. And it's coming from this tiny hominoid cousin of ours who had a brain about 550 cubic centimeters. Now, in contrast, our brain is about 1,300 cubic centimeters. Homo naledi are these really interesting evolutionary cousins we have. They have some really modern features, including really human-like wrists. By the way, our wrists are so complex because we use tools, so the inference being that Homo naledi probably used tools as well. But Homo naledi also has some very old evolutionary features. They're essentially these super intelligent, tiny, half human, half monkey things that lived in caves. The stone tools that were discovered with them are not universally accepted as tools. However, if the same artifacts were discovered in human caves, they would be declared as stone tools. Because this is controversial, a more conservative approach has been taken within some circles. One of the other things that has come out of this discovery is that Homo naledi are atomically very similar to humans in their brains. Part of their frontal lobes associated with syntax and recognizing emotions is super developed, and hints that they may have had language. I mean, of course they did, but that is, of course, conjecture. It is super possible that we interbred with them and that we have picked up some of their DNA in our DNA, but at the moment we haven't been able to sequence Homo naledi DNA. It's also possible that we just inherited some cultural traits from them, including burying our dead and maybe even art. Homo naledi lived 200 to 350,000 years ago, and that is about the time frame that Homo sapiens first appeared. The archaeological evidence here is really hinting that brain structure is so much more important than brain size or body to brain ratio for intelligence. moving on to physics. And now I've saved the most mind-bending, but also the most technical and confusing thing to the end. The double slit in time experiment. One of the most important experiments in physics is Young's double slit experiment. If you shine a light through a small slit, the light will diffract. If you do it through two small slits, the diffracted light from the slits will interfere with each other and create an interference pattern. Light is made up of particles called photons, and the thing is with particles, you can just limit that to just one particle. So if you send one photon of light at a time towards these slits, the photon will diffract as it passes through the gaps. But in theory, it has nothing to interfere with. So you don't expect to have an interference pattern, but that's exactly what we get. So the photon must be interfering with something. To explain why this happens, we never actually know the position of the photon. Quantum mechanics only gives us a probability density of where the particle will exist. So there is a probability that the photon traveled through the left slit and a probability that the photon traveled through the right slit. And those probabilities that the photon traveled through either slit interfere with each other to give us an interference pattern. If you've never studied physics, that's confusing and it takes a bit of getting your head around. I'm essentially saying that the photon traveled through both slits and interfered with itself. And that's the quantum mechanical explanation. Now we're going to get really, really trippy, and we're going to add an element of time travel to this experiment. To create a slit in time, scientists used a material called indium tin oxide, or ITO. It's a material found in most phone screens, and it changes from transparent to reflective after interacting with light. This transition takes about 10 femtoseconds, or 10 to the minus 14 seconds, which is an incredibly short amount of time even when we're talking about quantum mechanics. By firing a laser pulse at the ITO, we can rapidly change it from reflective to transparent and back again. This creates these tiny little pockets in time where the material is transparent and when the material is reflective, meaning that the photon that we fire can travel through those slits in time or not. I've already said that we don't know the position of the photon. That is because of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The more we know about an object's position, the less we know about its momentum, and vice versa. What a lot of people don't know, but which is much more freaky, is that that can be expressed as the more we know about an object's energy, the less we know about its time. That means that for the same reason, we don't know if the photon traveled through the left slit or the right slit, and then it interacts with itself. In a traditional double slit experiment, we don't know if the photon passes through the earlier slit or the later slit in time. All we know is that the photon has a probability of passing through the first slit and a probability of passing through the second slit in time. And just like the double slit experiment, it travels through both and it interferes with itself, just like a teenage boy. This shows up as a change in energy or a spike in color. How weird. As if that isn't weird enough, scientists believe that they can use the result of this to create computers that mimic the brain. And that has gone well past my understanding. I do not know how they're planning to do that. As the great physicist Richard Feynman once said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, then you don't. I hope you've liked this video. Bye bye.